If you've been following along on the channel, you'll know that I recently rented a Nikon Z6 Mark III, and I had it with me for about a week. I wanted to do this for a variety of reasons, but mostly just to check it out and see how it performs, since I'm less familiar with the newest Nikon cameras. But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button, and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind-the-scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold. So let's talk about the Nikon Z6 Mark III and my week with it. First of all, I do want to go through the features because if I don't mention this stuff, people will think I don't know it. And although you can see this on B&H and Amazon and in all of Nikon's marketing materials, at this point, everyone should know these features, but we can still go over them. Right now, the Z6 Mark III is listed around $2,200 US. That is cheaper than when it initially launched because it's been, I think, about 8 months since the camera was first announced. So we are seeing a little bit of a discount on the retail side of things. This is a partially stacked sensor, meaning you'll get faster read speeds, or at least that's the goal. That's in theory. It's a faster sensor with some downsides that we might talk about a little bit later. But basically, it's a partially stacked sensor, which is another claim to fame for the Z6 Mark III. We've got lots of great features, but probably the tentpole flagship one is this 6K 60 full sensor, no crop, shooting and RAW. You, of course, can do ProRes RAW as well, and it's pretty impressive what you can do with this camera. The Z6 Mark III is a powerhouse in terms of performance on both video and photo. I should have mentioned it's a 25 megapixel sensor, so that's where you get that 6K number from. 6K 60, uncropped and RAW. Really, really impressive. Also 4K 120, you can do full HD 240 for slow motion stuff. And then there's a ton of great photo features as well. It's got, you know, the tilting LCD screen, but it's not the full tilting, flipping, amazing screen that we're seeing, just kind of that, the new classic flipping foldable screen. We've got CF Express Type B and SD memory card slots, so that kind of offset combo of the CF Express Type B with an SD slot. I know there's a lot of people who would prefer just having the same slot, so 2 SDs or 2 CF Express Type B, and I go back and forth on which one I prefer. Sometimes I like having 2 different types, and other times I do wish they were the same. And then there's some cool camera to cloud direct connectivity. Now, I like all these features. Obviously, who wouldn't? 6K 60, uncropped, you know, NRAW, ProRes, it's all really great stuff. The fast sensor, really, really incredible. So the features are great, but obviously that's what they're selling to you. So if you're gonna buy a camera like this, they're gonna tell you all the great features that everyone is gonna love. So I want to talk about some of my personal nitpicks. If you follow the channel, you know that maybe sometimes I like to rant or complain a little bit, but honestly, in this day and age, that's kind of what I care about the most. How does the camera feel to use? What is it like to operate? Beyond the specs that, yes, all cameras nowadays are really, really good and can basically do any job. So whichever brand you like, that's totally fine. This is no judgment for Nikon or against Nikon or saying you should get something else is better or superior. This is just my opinion of using this camera for about a week, beyond just those features on paper of, hey, it can do all this great stuff. Yes, but what is it like to actually use it and have it in your hands? That's really why I rented the camera in the first place, because anyone can read the specs on Amazon or B&H. That's the easy part. It's using it. What's that like? That I find more valuable personally for me and how I like to shoot. Now, we do need to do a little bit of a disclaimer. Here's some things I'm not going to talk about. So I'm not going to really focus too much on photography. I think a lot for most people in most cases, photography has kind of peaked. And I don't mean that as a bad thing. I mean it as kind of a good thing. But realistically, you can buy a 10-year-old camera and still shoot great photos on it. I mean, a decade-old camera, those were the cameras that were being used for professional work back then. So a lot of that stuff from the DSLR days is still super, super valuable for photography. What's more interesting to me is the hybrid capabilities, and in particular video, because I want a photography camera that can take great pictures, but I also want it to shoot great video. There's plenty of people out there who will talk just about photography, and yes, I know there's a variety of photography cameras that are better and worse and somewhere in between, so I don't mean it as a downside, but if you just want a general purpose, like can take good pictures, of course this camera can do it, as well as almost any other camera out there that's new, as well as stuff that's old. It can all take great photos, so I'm not gonna spend too much time there. And I'm also not going to complain about the backward directions of Nikon. If you know Nikon, the focusing, the way the lens mount, there's some stuff that's the opposite direction and people will complain and say it's backwards. I'm not going to do that. I think that's just preference at that point and really doesn't matter all that much. So I'm going to try and stay away from any of those biased talking points that really aren't complaints or criticisms. They're just preferences, and I think you can adapt to any camera system. I'm also not going to talk about aesthetics. I also think that's very subjective. Some people will think certain cameras look cool or they're retro or they're ugly, and really personal preference. Again, I'm not going to talk about that, what I think the camera looks like, if it's got a cool vibe or not, because at the end of the day, I don't really care, and I don't think you should either. I'm not going to talk about grip size. This is another thing. People spend a lot of time on how it feels in the hand, but everyone's hands are different sizes, different shapes. And so ultimately, it doesn't really matter. If you care about how it feels in your hand, the best thing I can do is just recommend rent one, try it, get it in your hand, see how it feels. For me, it doesn't even matter. I'm not going to talk about it. And I'm also going to try and stay away from other pointless preferences, although I do have some preferences, but I'd argue that they're not pointless. And we're going to get into that because I do have some criticisms. I do have some complaints and things I wish were different, but it's not just merely, arbitrary. Oh, I like it this way and other people like it a different way. No, there's a good reason for why I think what I do and why I like what I do and why I shoot the way I do. So we are going to talk about that. Here's what I liked, because I do want to start on the positive, and it's a long list. 6K 60, full width of that sensor, obviously huge selling point, and that's why it's listed here again. We know it's a feature. That's why we should talk about it. 6K 60 is impressive. The stabilization with the lens, I was shooting with the 24-70. That is a stabilized lens. And I actually thought the stabilization was pretty good for the most part for what I do. Handheld, pointing it, and again, we're talking about video. This isn't for photography, but for video, general stabilization I thought was good. I wasn't expecting, walking gimbal-like performance or anything like that, but just pointing the camera in a general direction, keeping things fairly stable. I thought it did a good job. And other people have criticized Nikon and their stabilization. Well, with this stabilized lens, the 24-70, I thought it was actually good enough and certainly usable and something I liked. I also really like the speed of that sensor. Now, that 9.4 millisecond average, that's a rating from Gerald and Dunn. If you go watch his video, he kind of did all the testing, scientific stuff for the Nikon Z6 Mark III and the sensor speed. But in general, just know that this is going to be a fairly quick sensor. So you're going to have less rolling shutter artifacts, less of that jello, less of that skew, which nowadays a lot of people talk about why they like that, why they want a fast shutter, almost global shutter, even though this is a fraction of the cost of what global shutter cameras will cost you. So it is nice. It is there. It does come with some drawbacks that we'll get into, but if you need a fast sensor, the Nikon Z6 Mark III does have it, and I think that's great. There's also shutter angle on the Z6 Mark III with a firmware update that Nikon just put out not too long ago. So if you're a video shooter and you've been suffering with photography shutter speed for over 2 decades almost at this point in time, it's been quite a while that all these hybrid video photo cameras have just stuck with shutter speed. Obviously, if you're a Lumix shooter or some other cameras, shutter angle is in a lot of ways a lot better, a lot easier for video. Shutter angle is now on the Z6 Mark III. So I'm very thankful to Nikon for releasing that as a free firmware update. This isn't something you have to pay for or wait for the next generation of camera. It's right there on the Z6 Mark III. So if you have one, you can go download it. Or if you're thinking about getting the Z6 Mark III and the thing you were waiting for was shutter angle, well, now it has it thanks to this update from Nikon. So that's very much appreciated. I also really liked this auto ISO toggle on the Z6 Mark III. Basically what this is, and I can only compare it to what I'm kind of coming from, which is Lumix. But if you're looking to activate auto ISO on a Lumix, you have to scroll all the way to the left. It's basically the bottom or the leftmost option on the ISO menu. But on the Nikon, it works a little bit different. It's just a toggle on and off with one, I think it's the thumb, but maybe it's the index finger, one of the two. You can basically, when you're in, setting your ISO settings, you can just flip one way and it'll turn it on, and you flip the other way, it'll turn it off. And it's really nice to activate auto ISO if you're upwards of, like, let's say you're around 1600 or 3200 ISO and you just want to like pop to auto real quick and not go all the way back down to a lower ISO value just to turn on auto ISO like I have to do on the Lumix cameras. I thought that was a really nice implementation of this feature. And what it got me thinking was, This is why it's beneficial to use other cameras, other, brands, other ecosystems, that whole thing, because you get a feel for some features that maybe you didn't even know were missing. I've just been living with the Lumix limitation of scrolling all the way to the left to activate auto ISO. And now I'm looking at it going, oh wait, there is a much better way to do it. And I like how the Z6 Mark III does it. And it makes me wonder, am I missing something on my Lumix cameras? Is there a way to activate it quicker? Now it gives me some food for thought, some stuff to investigate, some stuff to try out on cameras I personally own to be more optimized, to be better. So I think it is very helpful. No matter who you are, no matter what you're shooting, try out other cameras from time to time just to kind of get that gut check, get that reaction of, is what you're using optimized to the fullest? Are there other brands that do a little bit better way? Is there stuff that you have that you can be very grateful for because other camera brands are missing it? It's really a kind of eye-opening to try new things, even if it's not a purchase and a big shift of selling all your gear and going somewhere else. Oftentimes you can find little optimizations or workflow hacks that can help you even using what you're using by trying something else. So that's something I'm going to investigate on the Lumix cameras, see if there's a better way to do it. But I really liked how convenient it was right by default on the Nikon Z6 Mark III. It's just an easy auto on off anytime you want at any ISO you're at. Very, very helpful, very efficient. And I like that. I also thought the LCD screen was really good quality. This is, very helpful when you're shooting outside or you just want that detail crisp and clear on the LCD screen. If you're shooting with an external monitor, obviously it's kind of a different story and it matters less, but I did think the LCD screen looked quite nice. It was crisp and clear and no problems there. And I also like that there's the top screen on the Z6 Mark III. It's kind of gone away. It's fallen out of favor in terms of a design, aesthetic, or principle. But when you're shooting and you just look down at the top of the camera, seeing a digital display there with helpful information, I think is always it's nice. It's a nice thing to have. Obviously, it's not a necessity. You can do without it, but I do like that it's there on the Z6 Mark III. And I like that there's this custom display layout feature. So again, comparing it to Lumix, which is what I'm most familiar with, you toggle through the display button and it'll show different information depending on what you want to see. There's usually like kind of the clean feed on the LCD screen, or you hit display and all the information will pop up, or you hit display again and some of it'll go away, but it'll still keep a few extra things there. And on the Z6 Mark III, I was kind of frustrated by what I was seeing by default. I wasn't seeing a histogram. The level gauge wasn't on the display version that I wanted. I was getting kind of frustrated with the Z6 Mark III, saying like, why can't I just see the information I want? And when I dug through the menus, I found that you could actually customize all these different displays. And I thought that was quite an eye-opening feature. Again, something I'm going to be looking for on Lumix or Canon or Sony from now on, this ability to customize those displays. So if there's information that you don't need, you can kind of just exit out from that display and you never have to see it again. Or if there's certain information like the histogram or the level that you always want on, you can add that to those displays. And I thought that was really clever, very helpful when it comes to what you want to see on that kind of heads up display that we all have gotten used to over the years. And of course, every brand does it a little bit different, but I really like that Nikon lets you customize that. Very, very nice. N-Log assist color. I liked how the assist LUT just looks on that LCD. So when you finally go into the camera, you get it in N-Log, which we're going to get into how you actually do that in a moment. But once you activate it, once you get that assist, I think the color on the LCD screen is just quite nice. It's very nice, pleasing color for skin tones, just saturation, contrast, everything for that display LUT is quite nice. And I would say is actually better than some of the other brands and their default LUT assist. Of course, other brands will let you load in your own LUTs and do all that, but I kind of like to judge things by their default, how they come from the factory, because one of the most irritating things is as you get more and more cameras over the years, or you're working on a team of people, you usually want them to operate at their best by default, just out of sheer convenience. It's the worst thing to have to re-customize a camera or take someone else's camera and they've customized it in their unique, quirky way, especially in a team environment. If you're an independent solo shooter, it's less of an issue, but when things just work by default, I don't know, it's such a good feeling just to pick up a camera and it works like you expect it to right out of the box. And you also know that anytime you buy that camera or pick it up from somewhere else, it's probably going to operate in that same way. When there's too much customization, too much unique factor, built in, or expected, I guess I should say, like they're expecting you to customize it to your own desire. Well, all of a sudden, every camera out in the wild is kind of different. And it can be frustrating having to switch them, or even if you have 2 or 3 camera bodies, remembering which ones, built a certain way. It's a lot to juggle. And I just like that default LUT looks as good as it does. One final thing I'll say on this list of things I liked about the Z6 Mark III is the fact that you can adapt Sony E-mount lenses to the Z-mount. This is something I didn't realize until maybe a month or two ago. It got mentioned in some other person's video, and I thought, wow, what a great feature that the Z-mount can take E-mount lenses. Of course, it might not be as optimized. I didn't really get to test it out all that much, but they do have adapters. If you have a lot of Sony glass and you want to use it on a Nikon body, you certainly can. And that's a great selling point for the Z-mount compared to other systems like the L-mount where you can't do that, at least not to my knowledge. There's no adapter for it currently. To be able to go from E-mount, if you have all that Sony glass, putting it on a Nikon body, very, very cool. And I'm glad that that's a feature of these Nikon Z cameras that you can actually do that. Of course, you don't have to. You could use the Nikon lenses, but if they're, too expensive or you're looking for a particular focal range that was made for E-mount, you can adapt to Z-mount, no problem. Now, let's take a break and talk about what I didn't like. And go with me here because I'm not just going to say it's all great, it's the best camera ever, you should buy it, because there's a lot of people who tell you about that about every camera. They'll say they're all great, they're all amazing, and that is true. But there is room to criticize and point out things that could be improved or could be better, or maybe are just my personal things that don't work for me, but maybe they work for you. This list shouldn't be painful. We can all get through it. We can all understand that we all have our own opinions. So bear with me as we go through it. I'm going to point out some things that I didn't like, and it's okay. We can do this. Now, we have to talk about this sensor because there is some shadow noise.
ISO 800, 1000, 1250, 1600, 2000, 2500, 3200, 4000, that's 5000, 6400, 8000, 10,000, 12,800, 16,000, 20,000, 25,600, 32,000, 40,000, 51,200.
When you're talking about a partially stacked sensor, faster readout speeds, people have talked about this. Plenty of people have talked about this, how it affects your noise and your dynamic range. And it is visible in the shadows. There is more noise compared to other cameras. So I was testing it with my Lumix S5 Mark II.
640, ISO 800, 1000, 1250, 1600, 2000, 2500, 3200, 4000, 5000, 6400, 8000, 10,000, 12,800, 16,000, 20,000, 25,600, 32,000, 40,000, 51,200.
Arguably, that's like an equivalent price point spec camera, still a full frame, similar resolution, but different sensor technology. The Nikon Z6 Mark III is that partially stacked sensor. The S5 Mark II is not. So it's got the slower read speed, so more rolling shutter on the S5 Mark II, but cleaner image, signal to noise ratio. So I was seeing some shadow noise on the Z6 Mark III. It is there. You can take it or leave it, but it is there. It's something I don't like. Obviously, noisy shadows is not something anyone wants, but maybe is a trade-off that you're willing to make for that faster sensor. So it's not an easy, like all good, all bad. It's kind of pros and cons. There's some trade-offs, there's some sacrifices, some compromise needs to be made when we're talking about this technology and how it functions. It's not, not everything is always a benefit. Sometimes there's a trade-off. So there is a little bit more noise in the shadows. Maybe you find that acceptable. I'm sure it's still clean enough for most projects, but if you need absolutely the cleanest of clean shadows, maybe you'll have to look somewhere else. I mentioned how much I liked the N-Log color assist because it looks really good, but I also didn't like it because it made it harder to expose. Once I turned my histogram on, I realized that a lot of the assist color was having me underexpose my images. So that color assist, the N-Log assist, is built to kind of underexpose everything. And when you turn on your histogram, you realize you have way more room towards those highlights, but all of a sudden it starts looking blown out, overexposed, improper. But if you're checking your histogram, you have the information, the data is there. It just looks really, really overexposed. So it can make getting your exposure harder because that assist color works the way it does. I don't know the right solution for this. I kind of just wish the default worked a little bit better in terms of what you see is what you get. So coming from Lumix and shooting vlog, and that assist color usually matches eyeball to histogram. I can look at it, get it exposed properly visually, and then I check on the histogram and it usually matches up pretty well. I was having a harder time doing that on the Z6 Mark III. Anytime I was looking at the screen, checking exposure with my eyes, I'd get it lined up. Oh, this looks great, looks really good. Colors, exposure, everything spot on. Check my histogram. Oh, wow, I'm way, way underexposed. Everything's in those shadows. And again, the shadows is where the noise is on the Z6 Mark III. So I was, okay, well, I need to crank up my exposure. All of a sudden, everything on the screen looks like it's blown out, but according to my histogram, it's not. So that was kind of tricky on the Z6 Mark III. It made it harder, again, in a what you see is what you get sort of way of exposing. Now, if you're able to load custom LUTs or you have an external monitor, that's a totally different story, and you can find a workaround. But again, I like things just to operate by default as kind of the best way, the what you would expect. I want to look at the screen, check my exposure, confirm with the histogram, and know that I'm good. And I couldn't do that very easily on the Z6 Mark III. I also struggled a lot with white balancing, and we really need to talk about this because this is kind of personal to me, I guess, in the way I shoot, which is kind of built, I guess, around the Lumix cameras. I've adapted to those for, gosh, over 10 years now. But when you set a custom white balance on the Lumix cameras, again, I'm not talking about dialing in a Kelvin. I'm not saying putting it on the sunshine logo and shooting daylight or picking a preset. Shooting a custom white balance, meaning you have a white card or a gray card, some kind of white reference source, and you set a white balance. It's very quick, very easy to do on the Lumix. You just tap up on the D-pad, take a picture, and it sets your white balance. You're good to go. It takes like half a second. Very, very simple. On the Z6 Mark III, I really, really struggled. There was no dedicated white balance button on the top, which is where I'm used to it being, and that's very similar to Canon cameras as well, do it that way. Sony does it a little bit different with one of the back buttons. I think it's one of the custom buttons, honestly. It kind of bothers me how they lay out their buttons on the Sony cameras. But I finally found on the front of the camera of the Z6 Mark III, on the front, right by the lens mount, there's two buttons there. And I realized one of them is your white balance button. I thought, okay, great, I finally found it. I can easily adapt to this, no problem. However, by using that front button, which I don't prefer, but I could get used to, it still just brings up a preset menu of previous custom white balances that you've set or other presets, again, daylight, fluorescent, tungsten, all those normal things, Kelvin, etc. But there was no way to set a white balance, like take a custom one from that menu. The other menu I had to go to was the I menu, which is kind of the quick menu on Nikon, and tab around, go into my white balance, and then you can set a custom white balance, but you have to long press the OK button. You have to hold it for what feels like a really long time, and then it will update and set a custom white balance. So this is kind of a personal nitpick and a gripe, but it really slowed me down and I never got used to it. And I don't think I ever would. It was just too clunky, too many menus, too many layers of buttons to sort through where I couldn't just get what I needed quickly. And if you're familiar with video and if you're running and gunning and you're just trying to set a quick white balance, the last thing you want to do is to stop for like 10 seconds to figure out, okay, how do I do this? What's the button combination? Let me back out of this menu, go into another one, tab over, get in there and long press. If you're used to that, if you've been shooting Nikon and that's normal to you, this probably sounds like me just griping for no reason. But literally compared to another camera system that does it far better, I can easily say that I don't like how the custom white balance is set on the Z6 Mark III. Yes, that's me. If you always use auto white balance or you just always use presets, it's not a problem. The Nikon can do that. But for custom white balancing, it was an issue for me and something I don't think will ever get sped up. I would equate it to a similar but different. The Canon cameras used to have to literally take a picture, go into image review, and take your white balance from that photo. You actually went through the menu, set custom white balance, pulled up the photo of the white card, and you set it that way. Super clunky on the Canon cameras. I think they've fixed that in recent models. This is like old school DSLR cameras. The Canon ones would do it that way. And this Nikon is a similar story. Yes, it functions a little bit different, but that slowness, those hiccups, the problem of like something I do very, very frequently, setting a custom white balance, being so slow, I did find to be quite a pain point for me and was very irritating. And there is a much better way to do this. Just look at some of the other camera systems that do it much faster and much better, in my opinion. There's also these hidden menu layers. So kind of hard to describe, but I was looking for N-Log in the Nikon camera menu. Of course, everyone's been talking about, oh, all the great color, and you can shoot RAW and you can shoot ProRes and all this stuff, but all I could find was the default picture profiles of standard and vivid and natural, all the ones that we're all familiar with, right? And I'm looking, where the heck is N-Log? And Nikon does something similar to what Sony does, in that they kind of separate these picture profiles, like the log stuff is separate from standard, vivid, etc. Again, coming from Lumix, this is one of those things that's just a no-brainer for me. Just put all your picture profiles in one menu and let me pick which one I want. Do I want standard? Do I want vlog? Let me pick. But these other cameras, they arbitrarily designate it. And on the Nikon, it's even worse because it's kind of hidden. I had to look up a YouTube video just to figure out how to turn N-Log on. And it's basically the Nikon Z6 Mark III in the menus. There's, for as deep in the menus as you go, you'll get to a page of settings, and there's usually or sometimes another page to the right that's kind of hidden. It's super weird to describe, but basically when you're picking kind of your resolution, your color space, all that kind of stuff, you can hit right one more time, right on the D-pad, and now you'll get to this N-Log or Rec 709 or HDR, color profile page where you can finally activate it. It took me far too long to find how to turn N-Log on. And then I found other situations where there was this like hidden menu to the right in the Nikon menu system. I'd end up on a page of settings, and lo and behold, if I hit right one more time, I would get another like sub page kind of hidden, not super obvious. I think there is maybe a small icon that tells you it exists, but there's no clear arrow or indicator on some of these settings that tells you you can continue to go right in the menu. And I found that super irritating and clunky from a UI standpoint. I think there's a much better way to do it because other cameras don't seem to have this problem. So again, I'm pointing it out as not a deal breaker, not a, hey, this camera sucks. I'm just pointing it out as a, this is really irritating and there's an obviously better way to do this. So if we don't point that stuff out, it never gets changed and we just have to keep suffering with this kind of clunkiness. And that's what I find. This hidden menu, like it doesn't need to be hidden. Let's make it a little bit more obvious, a little bit more intuitive. So if you're excited to get a Z6 Mark III and shoot N-Log, you can do it within the first minute. You don't have to go watch a YouTube tutorial to figure out how to activate this thing. Kind of silly. Next thing is the missing autofocus manual focus switch. This is common across lots of cameras. They don't have this switch, but I do think it's valuable, and probably I'll make a whole separate video about why I like having an autofocus manual focus switch, but there isn't one on the back of the Z6 Mark III. So when I first got my hands on it and I'm looking at it going, yeah, these buttons, this layout, like I can kind of get used to this. And then I realized, oh, there's no toggle, there's no flip for autofocus to manual focus. You have to go into the quick menu, some of the sub menus to activate that and change some of those autofocus settings. And even though these cameras call it a quick menu, anytime you're in the menu, it's not quick. It is quicker than the full menu, of course, but I always prefer buttons or switches for some of the stuff that I'm changing all the time on the fly, switching from autofocus to manual focus and back in an instant. And I a lot of times don't want to have to do it on the lens for stability reasons, for performance reasons, like, literally shaking the image, switching on the side, using my other hand. If it's right there with a back switch, it's very, very nice to have that autofocus, manual focus. If you've never had a camera with it, you probably don't know what you're missing. But for me, having that switch on the back is very helpful. I'll probably make a whole video about it, just why I like that so much. But yeah, it's missing on the Z6 Mark III, and I definitely felt it. I also thought it was kind of a pain to change the autofocus areas. This was because that switch isn't there. You have to go into that quick menu. Again, not very quick. And I always felt like it took me far too long to pick the autofocus area, to pick my zone, to pick anything. And it wasn't fast. And I guess I'm getting kind of used to having that luxury of just speed determining the box size of the area I'm focusing, where that box is located, if I have human detection on or off. All of that can be done a lot quicker on some of the other cameras out there. And I just felt like it was kind of slow and kind of clunky on the Z6 Mark III. This is maybe where I get a little bit of a nitpick, of a gripe, but the tight CF Express card slot, this is one of those things where it doesn't matter until it matters. So I put the card in, obviously I recorded. When I went to eject the card to copy all my photos and video over to the computer, I couldn't get the card out. It's just the tiniest little slot and my fingers didn't fit. So I said I wasn't going to talk about grip size, but I will talk about this because this actually matters. If you're in a situation on set and someone says, hey, can you hand me the media? Let's copy everything over. And you're sitting there struggling, trying to get a card out for 30 seconds, which no joke, that's how long it took me to get the card out of the slot because it didn't just pop out far enough. I had to really wedge it and to get that, super, super frustrating. And those are the things that look kind of amateur. And I've made a video talking about this. A lot of the difference between an amateur and a professional or someone who's new versus experienced is just the muscle memory. How comfortable do you look using the camera? And anytime there's something like this where the camera itself is making me look unprofessional is not something I want to sign up for. It's very irritating to know how to shoot, take great photos, take great video, and then all of a sudden look like a dummy trying to get a card out of a slot. I get what they're doing with these cameras nowadays, trying to make everything small and tight and compact, but I also think we need a little bit of room to just use them comfortably so everything's not crammed so close that it's difficult to use. So kind of a nitpick, kind of a minor gripe, but I did find it irritating. Every time I tried to take the card out of the CF Express slot, I just struggled far more than I thought I ought to. There's also these really long menu labels, meaning for resolution, for example, if you're trying to pick your resolution for video, it lists the full pixel resolution on the display on the screen. So it's kind of overwhelming, all the text. There's no short code or short label or abbreviated version. It's the full pixel resolution, like 5,372 by, 3,126 or whatever the number is. I don't remember off the top of my head because there's a lot of them. There's like 6K and 5K and 4K, and they're all listed out in the full label length. And I just thought, man, it'd be a lot easier if this was abbreviated. Visually, it'd be easier to select. And I think that's one of those things where, again, it's going to slow you down if you're trying to switch resolutions on the fly and you're sitting there reading a full pixel count. And you're like, no, which one? I want to be in 6K or I want to be in 4K or I want to be, whatever, 5.9K, simplify, abbreviate, I think would be very helpful. So not be visually overwhelmed by just laundry lists of numbers. It looked like I was looking at a spreadsheet on one of the screens and just thought there's got to be a better way. And then last but not least on this thing I didn't like was this no charging indicator, meaning you've got a USB-C port on the side of the Z6 Mark III. When you plug in, if the camera's on, it'll tell you it's charging. But if the camera's off, I didn't see anyway, a red light on the display screen, no indicator that it was charging. So I powered the camera off, plugged in USB-C to charge, and I got no reaction. The camera didn't do anything. It didn't light up. It didn't tell me anything. And I thought, oh shoot, do I have power? Do I not? Like, how do I check? How do I know? Turn the camera on. Okay, yes, it is charging. But then I had to turn it off. And again, no indicator light. So I thought that was kind of frustrating because imagine you're traveling, you're doing shoot after shoot after shoot, you're out in the field, and let's say you plug in to charge the camera, to charge the battery, rather is a better way of saying it. Yes, you could take the battery out, charge it separately, but a lot of times you might just want to plug into the USB-C to charge it up real quick. If it doesn't tell you that it's charging when it's off, it could be charging, or you might not have power to it. And that's very risky in a real world, real production environment where you think you're charging your camera, but actually you're not, you didn't have power. The outlet was off or you lost power. Something happened where maybe the external battery was dead. Very difficult to say confidently that, yes, I'm charging if there's no indicator for it. So something that could definitely be done better, either with like using that top LCD screen just to say, yep, I'm being charged, or a red indicator light or something to just signify that, hey, this is getting power and you're good. You can leave it alone and charge it up. So let's dive a little bit deeper because some of these are worth pointing out exactly what I think. Speaking of shadow noise, I really don't think it's a deal breaker for a lot of people, but it could be. And what I mean by that is depending on who you are, depending on what you shoot, if you can and you have the luxury of kind of overexposing and cleaning up those shadows, you might love the faster readout speed and not even worry about this. But if you're somebody who's often shooting in low light environments where things tend to be underexposed by default and you're constantly having to boost things up, this probably will become much more of an issue for you and your types of projects than someone else who's able to kind of overexpose and grade down. So depending on who you are, depending on your projects, you may or may not have an issue with this particular, issue on the camera, but it's hard to say. It's hard to draw that line of, do you want the rolling shutter speed, faster, slower? Do you want more or less noise in your shadows. Me, I tend to just want a cleaner image in general. I think it's nicer to look at, whether it's overexposed or underexposed. Just starting clean is always better and kind of what I prefer. Because a lot of stuff, I'm not doing stuff that's super high speed or whip panning or doing anything crazy with a lot of jello. I'm usually optimizing for just cleaner images in general, whether it's in the shadows, the highlights, wherever. I just want a clean image so it's less to clean up later. Yes, you can do post-production, AI, noise reduction. Another factor you might want to consider for the Z6 Mark III if that is part of your workflow. But for me, one less step means I can be more efficient, I can move faster. So I usually want to start with a cleaner image where I might prefer something like the S5 Mark II because it was cleaner by default at all those ISOs. So I checked the Z6 Mark III at all the ISOs with just a kind of black cap on it, just to see what the kind of inherent noise is on the sensor, as well as the S5 Mark II. And just found in general, like, of course, what everyone has been saying, that the Z6 Mark III is just a noisier sensor, but again, it's much faster, so pick your poison. That N-Log assist color, I think, could be optimized to just give you more of a, like, what you see is what you get, because that really is, I think, what all of us want when we're shooting. I want to look at the display with confidence and then also have the histogram there as a check, or the vector scope, or whatever you use for your exposure assisting. But a histogram certainly works fine. I just want it to match what I'm visually seeing, and I don't want to have to overexpose constantly or underexpose or do any kind of trickery or games to get what I want at the end. I just want it to look good by default. So I think that N-Log assist color should be revised. And I think there's actually the limitation on the Z6 Mark III that you can't load custom LUTs. You should check me on that. I don't know if that's true or not. The camera is gone now, so I can't check it myself, but it is one thing that I missed in the week long that I had it. Trying to load in custom LUTs, it's not even something I got to. And so I think it's unfortunate that that assist color looks as good as it does, but gives you kind of the wrong exposure or underexposed when you may want to overexpose given the particular sensor. White balancing, we really talked about, but I gotta stress, like this is something that really slowed me down. I found it super irritating, and it has been done so much better on other cameras. And I wish more of these companies would just copy each other. When something's working, when something works well, like, I don't know, a red record button. Everyone has red record buttons because it's just, that's what you do. That works. Red for record. If someone started having a green record button, or on another camera it's blue, and another camera the record button is yellow or purple or gray, it'd be very irritating to have to bounce between all these different camera systems when they're all doing it in kind of like for no good reason, a different way. Red for record. Okay, cool. That's a standard. We've all accepted red for record. White balancing, there are clearly better, good ways. Like, just point the camera at the thing that's white, hit a button, and you're good to go. Any other solution or system or menu layout or button press combination shouldn't even be an option. We should all, for every camera, they should all just copy each other. And you point it at the thing that's white, you hit a button, and you got your white balance. At least that's how I think it should operate. And it seems like that should be the best way for it to operate, because that's all I needed to do. Where's my white reference? Hit a button, you're good to go. And yet, still to this day, so many cameras fail at this one simple thing. Those changing the autofocus areas, again, we kind of talked about it in depth already, but it's one thing that other cameras do, I would say, arguably better, and where I wish there was just more copying, more parallels, more sameness across all these camera brands, especially when there is something that is faster and better and just more intuitive. If you have to go through a menu, even a quick menu, to change something, it gets really slow and really clunky. And I just think there's a lot better ways that we can be changing autofocus areas, the size of them, and moving them around to give us a lot more creative control over our images. A lot of times on the Sony cameras and even on the Z6 Mark III, I feel kind of stuck in the autofocus mode I'm in, because it's just enough effort to switch it that it's a huge pain. And so I end up not. I end up just dealing with it as it is, because to change it, to change the size, to change the type, just ends up being a little bit too much friction. And so I opt like, okay, I'll just make it work with what I have. Now, that may be depending on your personal mindset and how you approach these cameras. Of course, it's not that much effort. It's not that hard to change it. So if you hear that, that's what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's enough friction to make it like you're weighing the pros and cons of, do I switch it or do I not? In real time, as you're shooting and you're wondering, you're like, yeah, I can make it work. So like, I'll just stick with what I've got. Yeah, I can make it work. I'll just stick with what I got. Yeah, I can make it work. I'll just stick with what I got. And that thought process over and over again limits you from actually using the full spectrum of modes that are offered if there's just too much friction to actually activate them. And so I think on any of these cameras, for as dynamic as they are, for as amazing as they are, for all the features they have, if switching between those features is just a little too clunky, you're less likely to do it. And that's why I wish more of that stuff was optimized from a user interface perspective. Lastly, I want to talk about quick menu versus button combos. And this is something that I've gotten very accustomed to, button combinations versus a quick menu. Yes, we all know the full menu is really slow and cumbersome. If you dive into the menu, you're often hunting because who remembers if it was on page 7 or 8 and how many layers deep? Yes, the full menu is slow, but those quick menus are also slow. If I'm on, tab 1 of the quick menu and I gotta toggle over and enter into another submenu, it's not that fast. What's faster is these button combinations. And I would equate it to video games and controllers, right trigger, left trigger, A, B, start, stop, that whole thing. If there's a certain combination of buttons that get you what you want in a video game, that's way quicker than the menu, even if it's a quick menu that you pull up on screen, you gotta toggle around and sift through. And cameras are the exact same way. There's lots of cameras out there that give you buttons or button combinations that get you what you need way faster, because then it is just muscle memory. It's A, B, right, left. Not exactly, that'd be like on a game controller, but you get what I'm saying. There's certain button combinations you can do on certain cameras that will get the results you want versus other cameras bury that stuff in the menu or in the quick menu, and it just feels a little sluggish and a little slow. I much prefer these button combinations, physical buttons with toggles, with switches, to get what I want. It speeds up production, and those savings, those seconds, builds in the muscle memory, builds in that confidence, builds in the professional aesthetic of just working like, you can do it almost without even looking, which is the best part. Another thing people talk about is cars. If there's a touchscreen menu, how clunky it is, how much you have to look at it versus other cars with buttons. So the more button combinations we can kind of build into these cameras, the better, I think, from a just shooting without having to look. You can just stay through the viewfinder if you're taking photos, or you could be focused on your framing, composition, focus, all that stuff while you're doing button combinations with your hand, whether it's your left or right. So I really, really prefer that. Now, let's not forget, let's all remember, I said a bunch of good stuff too. So here's that list again, so you can look at it and say, oh yeah, he did say good things about this camera. It wasn't all complaining, because that is a really good list. And I agree, it's a great camera. Here's what doesn't matter to me. RAW and ProRes. This has become a big selling point for all these camera companies, and it just doesn't matter to me for most of the stuff that I do. Yes, I'm glad that it's there as an optional feature, but when it's put on the masthead, if it's the tentpole thing of, hey, you can shoot RAW, or someone says, oh, it's amazing because you can shoot RAW, that's not a selling point to me. That's not a feature that I care all that much about. I'm glad it's there for the people who need it. I'm glad it's there if I ever want to dig it out the 1% of time I need it. But if that's your main selling point, RAW or ProRes for any camera company, I just don't care. It doesn't matter that much to me, nor do I think a lot of people nowadays. It's just, I don't know. The files are enormous. They're much larger. So the moment you switch to RAW on the Z6 Mark III, I think you're like, I had like hours of, record space available. And I switched to RAW, and I think it was like 9 minutes or something like that. It was crazy. It was absurd, the amount of storage space that would be taken up if I was shooting RAW or ProRes. And this isn't exclusive to Nikon. This is for any of these cameras, but it's just something that when people point out like, oh, but it can do this, I personally don't really care because it's not that valuable to me. In fact, if I had to shoot that way, it would be a detriment because I'd be spending tons of money in storage space, hard drives, solid state drives, backup, redundancy, all that stuff. So having just good, clean H.264, H.265, that's 10-bit 422, that's great. That's good for me. I love the cost savings in terms of storage that those files provide compared to ProRes or RAW. Here's what does matter to me. Open gate and ease of use. And these are the things that I always keep coming back to. There's a handful of cameras out there that can shoot open gate, and there's an even smaller amount of cameras that can shoot open gate at an affordable price point. That is such a huge feature, and if you don't know why, you can go look it up, but I do so much open gate, so I can shoot vertical and horizontal at the exact same time. Let alone if you want to do anamorphic, open gate is the right way to do anamorphic, aside from, you know, using these silly anamorphics that are like 1.3x, like that's hardly any. That's not even anamorphic, not even really. So if you're using like 1.33x with 16:9, like you can do it, but the right way to shoot anamorphic is open gate, and the right way to shoot multi-aspect, vertical and horizontal content at the same time is open gate, along with ease of use. There's just some tools that are easier to use than others. And aside from the specs, aside from the features, that ease of use I find so important because that's what affects me day to day, shoot to shoot, month to month, year to year. If it's easy to operate, it's fun to operate. If it's slow, if it's clunky, if I'm constantly struggling, constantly fighting with the device, with the tool itself, the way it's built, that's kind of a deal breaker for me. Doesn't matter how great it is. Doesn't matter if it has all the bells and whistles. If it just isn't easy to operate, then I kind of struggle and I go, I'll go with something else. And some of that might be experience and what you're used to using. You know, if you're used to driving a particular brand of car, you maybe feel more comfortable in that brand of car. And then other times it might be an actual legitimate, like it just doesn't do what you need it to do. And those are the things I try and point out as much as possible. That manual focus, autofocus switch, I use like all the time. I don't know how to quantify it other than like, I just need it to be there. So when it's not on any particular camera, even on something like Lumix, like the Lumix S9 doesn't have that switch. Very, very frustrating, very irritating, has other ways. So let's talk about that. Lumix, a brand that I love, cameras that I love. There's a clear difference between the S5 Mark II and the buttons that it has versus the S9. The S9 is not as good as the S5 Mark II from just a button layout standpoint. There's too many submenus, different combinations of buttons that are just slower, harder to use, not as intuitive, not as easy as the S5 Mark II. And I have both, and I use them both side by side. So the more cameras you get your hands on, the more you get comfortable knowing, oh, this works and that doesn't. And I kind of, yes, there's always the more expensive cameras that, you know, arguably should do things better, but there's also this mid-range of camera that I think can be the best version of the camera, the best hybrid with all the buttons that does everything you need at an affordable price point. And for me, that Z6 Mark III is just missing a few too many things that make it a little bit harder to use than I personally would like. So what do I think? Can I recommend the Z6 Mark III? Yeah, I could. If you like Nikon, you want to adapt E-mount lenses to Z-mount, if you want to shoot or need to shoot 6K 60 rather, uncropped, like go for it. It's a great camera. And a lot of the things that I find limiting with it probably won't affect you because you maybe don't even like those things or don't even know that those things exist. But for me, I've gotten so used to having the features that I have that I don't want to give them up. Certain buttons, certain switches, certain features like open gate are just too good to lose. And it doesn't matter how fast the sensor is or how great the specs are. Yes, the Z6 Mark III is a powerhouse. It's a great camera. It's awesome. And any camera nowadays can produce exceptional images, whether it's Canon or Sony or Blackmagic or Fuji, Panasonic. It doesn't matter. They're all really, really good. So what I'm left with is which one do I like to use? Which one feels the best? Which one does what I need it to as quick and efficiently as possible, where I'm not fighting, where I'm not struggling. It's just easy to use. It's effortless. That's what I personally like. And you could probably get there on the Nikon. You just get used to the way it works, the quirks, what I find clunky, maybe you wouldn't even notice. And maybe vice versa. If you picked up a Lumix camera, you might say, oh, this feels clunky. But also, if you don't know how to use it, that's another part of the story as well. So I think a lot of our opinions and our preferences are kind of self-reinforced just because the way I shoot is a direct result of the cameras that I use. And so it's almost self-reinforcing. And maybe you're the same way. If you use a particular camera, it's going to inform the projects you do and how you do them. So the moment you shift to something else, it can be very difficult and there can be quite a bit of friction there, which makes sense. It's muscle memory, so to speak, at a certain point. But I do think there's enough things that I would say arguably are done better elsewhere for me that I'd say, the Z6 Mark III, it's a great camera. I'm sure it's awesome. If you really want Nikon and you have a Z8 or maybe you just like Nikon, great camera. Certainly pick one up. But if you're looking and you're coming from another system, you're saying, hey, I shoot Sony or I shoot Canon or I shoot Lumix and this Z6 Mark III looks pretty attractive. For me, that's what I thought. And I used it and I ended up not enjoying it as much as I thought I would. I thought Nikon had fixed a lot of this stuff, some of those Nikon quirks that I just, it makes it a struggle to use, for me anyway. I thought they had fixed a lot of that stuff because people talk about how great the Z6 Mark III is. And me coming to it from an S5 Mark II, I just made me love my S5 Mark II all that much more, which is a good thing as well. So if you're thinking about the Z6 Mark III and you're tempted or whatever, rent one, try it out, see what you think. Maybe you'll fall in love. But for me, I didn't. And it made me just appreciate what I already have, which is probably a good thing because in the long run, that just saves me money. And I get a little bit more experience, a little bit more wisdom, a little bit more well-rounded perspective, which is all I really wanted in the first place.